with a note and a gift and to say thank you for being here this morning. So thank you and welcome to you all again this morning. Folks, if we haven't met yet, my name is Tyler Christiansen. I've been here about 13 months now, and I'm honored to be the pastor here at Grace and excited to be with you this morning. We have been, during this month of July, in a sermon series on the Judges. And so I want to give you a little bit of background and get you up to speed on that for those of you who are joining us for the first time this month, or maybe it's been a long while since you've read through Judges. But real quick, we find this book in the Old Testament, and here's what's happened so far. You may remember that the Hebrew people became slaves and in bondage in Egypt under Pharaoh, and God led the people out by the guidance of Moses. They went into the they went into the wilderness for 40 years before they were allowed to enter into the promised land. And when they entered into the promised land, they found that the land was already occupied. And so the book of Joshua talks a lot about establishing a community within that place, some new enemies that the people were fighting with, and then we get to the point where Joshua dies, and now this is the period of the Judges. And so Judges, as we've talked about for the past couple of weeks, and just another reminder about this, Judges, sometimes we're inclined to think about that name as being like a judicial role, like we think about in the justice system. But Judges in the Bible is probably a better translation would be the word deliverer. So when we're talking about the Judges, we hear that God lifts up somebody who is meant to be a deliverer to the people. And that's what the role comes to represent. Now, there's a couple examples of people like Deborah who actually have a judicial kind of role, but most of the time what we're going to find is that when we're talking about Judges, we're going to be talking about someone who is a deliverer and usually is a warrior or in a militaristic kind of sense. So that's where we're going to pick up today, and we're going to read about one of the earliest judges. We talked about Deborah so far 2 weeks ago. Last week, Stephen Ingram preached and did a wonderful job. He talked about a judge named Jephthah, kind of a rough story there. Today, we're going to get into another kind of action-packed story, and it's going to get a little PG-13 in here, so just warning you. And if you want to go and read through the rest of Judges, by all means do so. There's some R-rated stuff in there too, which maybe you're saying that's not for me, or some of you are like, ooh, yes. Let me get to Judges when we get home. I got some afternoon reading. So here we are. This is picking up. I'm going to be reading from the 3rd chapter in Judges, starting with verse 12. And we're reading about a judge today named Ehud, E-H-U-D. With verse 12, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, he went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of Palms, which is another name for Jericho, by the way. So the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab for 18 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, a judge, Ehud, son of Gera the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. The Israelites sent tribute by him to King Eglon of Moab. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Now, there's a lot more here to the story, and I'm gonna get you up to speed on that. But before we do, this has been now the cycle that we see in Judges. The people are oppressed by one of the foreign neighbors. There's been trouble there, and so they cry out to God. They say, "Save us, rescue us." God sends a judge. The judge, as I said, oftentimes a warrior comes, kills the enemies, calls the people to battle, and then there's peace in the kingdom again for a short period of time. And one of the challenges, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago with the book of Judges, is that for many of us, this is sort of problematic language, right? God, wipe out our enemies, make us victorious, make everything better. And there's something that's a little bit hard to swallow about that for us who generally want to think of God in a role as a peacemaker, as a peace broker that wants to bring peace and justice for all people. But remember that the point of Judges as a book is not to be a book that helps us with a moral compass. That's not the point. There's not ethics being communicated to us in the book of Judges. Judges is telling us about the history of the Israelites, and this is the next chapter in that history. We've moved now from Joshua and the conquest time period to now this period of the Judges. They're still trying to figure out what their identity is as the Israelites, and they're trying to figure out how do we keep our neighbors, our hostile neighbors, at bay during all of this. So here's what's happened in the story. You heard that King Eglon, who is a Moabite. Now, the Moabites live in the country of Moab, which is east of the Jordan River. So today, like in present Jordan. And he's across the river. And later on, we will find out in the book of Ruth that Ruth is a Moabite. So before that time period, we have the Moabites and the Israelites, and they are feuding with each other, and they're clashing over the same land. And so the people have turned their back on God. King Eglon, the Moabite leader, has gotten stronger and stronger. And then the people cried out, "God, save us, deliver us again." And so God sends Ehud. Now, what do we know about Ehud? He's a Benjaminite, so he comes from that tribe of Benjamin, one of Jacob's sons from Genesis. And we hear that he's a left-handed dude. I mean, who cares, right? Except that should be a little bit of foreshadowing. This is going to matter. This is going to be an important detail in the story. Now, there's all kinds of other stuff in the Bible about left-handedness, and that's for another day. But for the purposes of our story, he's left-handed. So he does this. He's supposed to give a tribute. He's supposed to take a payment, a bribe, a payoff, really, like Eglon's a mob boss, and he's supposed to take this payment tribute to the king. And before he goes, he comes up with this plan. He sharpens himself a homemade dagger. It's sharp on both edges, and it's not very long from the pointed tip to the hilt of the dagger. And it's just long enough to go on the inside of his right thigh. So he puts it under his robe and he straps it to his right thigh. So he goes to bring the tribute to the king, and he's probably carrying something, and he would have been frisked. Anybody would have when they go into the presence of the king. I mean, that's just protocol. So he's going to get frisked, but he gets frisked where everybody would have been frisked, which is your right side. Because right-handed people, you'd assume most folks are right-handed, are going to draw their weapon from their right side. You don't draw it like this. It's not a gun. It's a sword. So you draw it from your right side, or your left side. He, however, is left-handed. He's got his strapped to the right thigh, and he doesn't get frisked there. So he gets past security. He goes in, he delivers this tribute to King Eglon, and right after he does it, he's walking away and he says, "Ooh, I almost forgot. One more thing I need to tell you about." "Well, spit it out, boy." He said, "Well, it's a secret." So, it's a secret. Oh, so King Eglon says, "Everybody out of the room. Clear the room. We need the room, just this young man and I." Ehud goes up and he's acting like he's going to whisper something into the king's ear, reaches into his left thigh, takes out the dagger and plunges it in. Now, the other detail of this story that I forgot to mention, this is kind of gross, and you can read about this because the Bible has lots of detail on this. Eglon is a really big guy. King Eglon is a huge man. In fact, his name, Eglon, means fatted calf. So the Bible's like poking fun of him, but then there's also going to be other stories in the Bible about the killing of the fatted calf. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan, right? The younger brother comes home and kill the fatted calf, right? So he is the calf. But remember, the Israelites have also been worshiping foreign gods, and the Canaanite god, Baal, is a cattle god, right? So Eglon represents the cattle. So this man, their assassin, is going to go kill the fatted calf, the cattle king, right? And so he plunges his dagger into him, and his flesh rolls fold over the hilt of the dagger so that it is no longer even visible, and he's just huddled over like this. Again, if you want to read all the gory detail, there's more. He goes and he's walking out, now this is now Ehud. He goes and he's walking out of the castle and the throne room at this time, and he goes in and he pulls the doors closed and locks them behind him. And the guards look at Ehud suspiciously, and he says, "Oh, he told me to tell you he needed to relieve himself, so give the man a couple of minutes. He wants his privacy." At that time, Ehud takes off and he goes back out just outside of the earshot of the kingdom, and he takes out a shofar, a ram's horn, and he blows into it, which is the sign to his army to muster the troops. It's time for battle. And before you know it, the guards say, Eglon's been in there for quite a while. We haven't heard from him. They knock. He's not responsive. They break the doors down. They find him dead on the floor. And by this time now, the army of the Israelites have gone in and sacked the Moabites. And it says at the end of the passage, and there was peace in the kingdom for 80 years. 80 years. Remember, biblically, 40 years is a generation. So there was peace in the kingdom for 2 generations. Here's the funny thing. The cycle within the book of Judges is very repetitious. So if I were to read to you about the judge before Ehud, that was Othniel. And Othniel in 3:7 starts like this. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of their Lord, forgetting the Lord their God and worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. Moving ahead to chapter 12, Othniel dies. Here's Ehud's time. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Moving ahead to chapter 4, story of Deborah and Barak. The Israelites did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You see the pattern here. This is what's going on in this story time and time again. The people turn away from God. They worship foreign gods. Foreign leaders rise up. They conquer the Israelites. The Israelites are living in desperate times. They call out to God, ask for redemption, and the cycle continues. This is the story of the book of Judges. A few years ago, a book came out. It was by a guy named Carlos Whitaker. And some of you may have heard of him before. He's a Christian recording artist, does some speaking gigs from time to time, and he wrote a book. Now, Whitaker is a PK, a pastor's kid. And one of the stories that he remembers from his childhood that his father would tell was a story about a day that a woman from the congregation came to speak to his dad. She went to the pastor and said, Pastor, I need prayers today. And he said, okay, well, can you be more specific? I mean, what do you want to pray about? She said, my head is full of cobwebs. It is clear, it is fuzzy, it is not clear. I need the cobwebs cleared from my mind. Help give me clarity and vision. Okay. So the pastor takes her hands, prays with her. Pastor Whitaker prays for her, prays that the cobwebs would be cleared away. He's a little surprised that the next day the woman shows back up at his office and said, Pastor, I'm going to need more prayers again. Okay, what this time? Cobwebs. You need to clear the cobwebs. Just taking over, clear the cobwebs. Okay, so they pray for clarity again and for the cobwebs of her mind to be removed. Third day, she shows up again. What can I help you with? I would like you to take the cobwebs away through prayer again, please. He says, I'm not praying to take the cobwebs away today. Why not? Because today I'm going to pray that you learn how to kill the spider, he said. That's the title of the book, Kill the Spider. The idea is, of course, what we see here in Judges. I mean, it occurs to me that the book of Judges is kind of a funny book, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's full of all these stories of espionage and intrigue and violence and assassinations and all this stuff that keep it to be really interesting and a page turner. But as a preacher and as Christians trying to mine some of the nuggets of wisdom or truth or what is God trying to speak to us in this book about, it's a little bit hard to come by in stories like Ehud's. I mean, it's sort of an interesting story, but okay, so what? Is this just to be about, yes, this was just another chapter in the story of the Israelites, or is this meant to be something that's a placeholder on this timeline, or is there something else for us? And the more I was thinking about this, the more I realized that what's happening through this pattern of the people turning away from God and then crying out in desperation again, asking for redemption and for a deliverer, is kind of like coming back to God and saying, God, clear the cobwebs. Right? That's what's happening in these stories over and over again. God, we've had bad luck for the past 18 years with this King Eglon of Moab. Would you please take him away from us? Clear the cobwebs. And then guess what? Everything is good because God does that, sends Ehud, and it's peaceful for 80 years until we get 80 years later. Ehud dies. Nobody remembers it. 2 generations have passed. They fall into the same problems again. This time, they're going to have Deborah and Barak save them in Jael. A little bit later, we're going to get to the point where it's going to be about Jephthah and so on, right? And the cycle keeps repeating because what happens is they never kill the spider. They never address the root of the problem. To put it another way, it's like they keep medicating for the symptoms, but never for the disease. The disease here that the people are struggling with is that they never give their full attention and allegiance and their lives to God, but that they're always sort of giving half-hearted allegiance to God. And what ends up happening is the cobwebs keep coming back. And so they say, well, let's just get rid of those and everything will be fine, but they never really get at the root of the issue. Now, I'd like to say, and we'd all like to think that this is something that, that was an Old Testament problem, right? Let's just call that one 5,000 years in the rearview mirror. But the truth of the matter is that it doesn't take a lot of creativity to start thinking about all of the examples of where we're continuing to try to wipe away cobwebs and never really going after the spider. We're treating the symptoms and never really the disease. And this is something that was happening on a cultural kind of way with the Israelites. And I guess I would say, I think it's pretty clear that this is still happening in the American Christian church today. Now, I've been here about a year, and so there are all kinds of things that I would really be interested in sharing with you, but they're pretty hot button and a little hot right now, so I'm not going to go into those. So let's talk about something safer as far as an example, all right? Do you remember a couple of years ago, and this seems to have a little sputter-up resurgence every year in December, but a couple of years ago it was something that people lost their minds over, and it was when you walked into Walmart in December, if they said Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays. Remember this? And we had like culture wars about this. Or the people that would say, oh my gosh, Starbucks did away with the green and red cup at Christmas time. And people would lose their minds about this, right? And to me, what a perfect cobweb example. I mean, that is a cobweb type of thing. People, going on these long tirades on Facebook or something like that because they feel absolutely incensed that they went into Walmart and somebody had the audacity to say Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas. And it's kind of fascinating to think about that because what a perfect example of a cobweb type of thing. Well, what's the spider then? How about this? What's the matter with our Christian culture when we're trying to take our cues from Walmart? How about this? We're relying on spiritual guidance from Starbucks instead of coffee. I mean, that to me is like a spider versus cobweb type thing. You see what I'm saying? And I don't think it's probably a perfect example, but if you go home this afternoon and just look through your social media feed and you see what has gotten somebody riled up, I bet you 9 times out of 10, it's a cobweb and not the spider. Because we love to address the symptoms and steer clear of the illness. It is much safer for us, and it's easier for us to point fingers when we're talking about symptoms and not the illness. Because if we're going to address the illness, that means that something within us is going to have to change. You get what I'm saying? I mean, it's a lot easier to say, I wish that wasn't the case, instead of saying, wait a minute, what about me is so bothered by this? Is my faith so fragile that the color of a coffee cup is going to make me go crazy? What about this for a spider? Maybe the spider isn't even that Walmart and Starbucks are giving us some of our cues for how to respond during the season of Advent. What about this? What if the deeper spiritual decay is how this is about consumerism? Now, we don't want to touch that. We just want to pretend like the fourth quarter of every year, that's just kind of the way it is. But if we really address that, that makes us uncomfortable. So it's much easier instead to just lob complaints into the ether on Facebook about how we were greeted at a national retailer. Now bring this back to your life. I know that every one of us has some symptoms that we go after when we don't really want to get at the illness. There are some things that we use these cobwebs to actually hide behind because we don't want to get at what this thing is really about. What is it that makes you angry? Does it make you angry because it makes you uncomfortable? Because it makes you call some things into question? Because it makes you go back and revisit something or reimagine something or take new ideas into account? I mean, these are the kinds of things that we get worked up about, and it's easier for us to just pray for the cobwebs to be cleared. And I think that that's what's going on in Judges. Instead of sitting down and having a deep conversation individually as families or as individuals or as the collective community and saying, what is it that causes us to continue to be seduced by these ideas of worshiping these foreign gods or praying to these foreign idols, these statues? What is appealing to us about this? Is it because our faith is not strong enough to sustain us through the rough periods? Or is it because we just find ourselves easily manipulated into these things because we are of weak conscience on this? I don't know the answer. But I think it was easier for them to fall out of their faith tradition and pray for a clearing of the cobwebs. God, send us a deliverer so we don't have to deal with this. So this is the cycle in the book of Judges. The problem is that this is a sermon. And so there's supposed to be good news in this. And the hard part about this is that, yeah, okay, this is raw, this is gritty, this calls for some self-examination. But think of what's on the other side of the coin from this consistent message throughout the book of Judges. If the consistent message throughout the book of Judges is the people keep screwing up and calling for a deliverer, the positive side of that coin is God is steadfast throughout that whole thing. Whenever the people have said, God help us, God doesn't say, not this time. God says, okay, we'll do it again. Maybe this time will be better. And when they screw up again and say, God help us, God says, I'm here, let's do it again, let's try it again. And they try it again and again and again. And it just keeps going that way until the period of the judges ends. And then this period of the kings starts over. And then we fast forward a couple hundred more years and all of a sudden we get to the time of Jesus. And this is where the story really turns for us. Because Jesus is a deliverer. We don't refer to him as a judge, but he plays the same kind of role in that he brings an era of hope for the people. But this is not a finite era. This is a time for all time. And this is not just for a select group. This is for all people. And so when we look at what Jesus is really about, we say that Jesus is coming and he is going to redeem, he is going to rescue, he is going to deliver the people, and not just us, but all people, and not just for now, but for all time. And that is where the true good news lies. Because the character of God has been the same throughout. I am going to always be there. When you cry out to me, I will respond. But I'm going to tell you what I've told you before, which is I have already given you the Redeemer for all time. And there is nothing that you could do. There is not so many mistakes that I would not go back to you. There is nothing that would cause separation permanently between you and I, because I love you so much. I sent my very son for you, to live for you, to die for you, to be raised for you, so that you would have a once and for all Redeemer. And God does not follow the same pattern as in the book of Judges. This is not going to be a warrior who slays the enemy and hopes it goes away with violence. This time, the one will come sacrificially, and the violence will be done to him. And why is violence done to him? because the people said, "We had hoped you'd be a warrior, and you have let us down profoundly." And Jesus has taught, and Jesus has corrected, and Jesus has challenged, and Jesus has loved, and Jesus has welcomed, and he's rewarded with crucifixion. So God said, "I'm going to make things right for all time. We're not going to kill ourselves or kill our way to peace. I'm going to offer myself up as peace for you, once and for all time." The story of Judges never mentions Jesus. We don't get to Jesus till the New Testament. But the message, I think, is consistent. God hears. God responds. God delivers, which doesn't mean that there won't be cobwebs. We're going to experience pain. We're going to suffer. There's going to be hardship in our lives, for sure, guaranteed. But the most important part is intact. The spider has been dealt with. The thing that keeps us eternally separated from God is no more. God will always be there, because in Jesus Christ we have the once and for all time, for all people deliverer, who came to humanity and said, "Here I am. Follow me. Rejoice, for in me is the bread of life, the living water. You will hunger and thirst in the deepest parts of you no more, because you have received me." And that is good news, even in Judges. Let's pray.